have proposed in past years using a real estate transfer tax to help build more affordable housing. And we've even tried to shift it and change it a bit to make it more appealable. But I think we have too many people that are a no new taxes crowd in any way, shape, or form. And so that becomes really difficult to pass anything that could disincentivize the ultra wealthy to help build more housing for those that live and work here permanently.
Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast focused on incredibly talented people who've dedicated themselves to public service when their country and communities needed it the most. I'm Ryan Coonerty. Along with Debbie Cox Bolton of the New Deal, I'm lucky enough to be your co-host. The New Deal is an organization that supports the next generation of American leaders. Check out newdealleaders.org to find out more. Wyoming Democratic leader Mike Yin represents one of the most beautiful and wealthy places in the world, Jackson Hole, Wyoming, adjacent to the Grand Teton National Park. With that beauty comes challenges, income inequality, access to housing and healthcare, and being in one of the most Republican states in the country. Yet every day he finds opportunities to fight for his constituents. We talked about his strategies to shape legislation and what it's like being the first Chinese American legislator in his state's history. Enjoy. Wyoming Democratic leader Mike Yin, welcome to An Honorable Profession.
Very much appreciate to be here, Ryan. Happy to chat about whatever you got.
Well, first, let's start with you get to represent one of the most beautiful areas of the world. Can you tell our listeners who haven't had the good fortune of being around the Tetons what your district looks like?
So sure, yeah. I am the state representative for House District 16. In Wyoming, House District 16 is the town of Jackson. Commonly, the valley is referred to as Jackson Hole. So if you've ever thought about what living next to really tall mountains piercing the sky looks like, that's Wyoming. So my district covers the town, but the county itself covers Grand Teton National Park, as well as the southern end of Yellowstone National Park as well.
And just, I mean, if anyone gets a chance, beautiful, huge glacial lakes, great to jump into and then jump out of quickly because they're so cold, but just an amazing, amazing place. You are in the super minority in the state legislature. I don't think people think of Wyoming as a liberal bastion, but you are trying to drive policy. Can you talk a little bit about the makeup of the legislature and where there are opportunities to make improvements for your community?
Sure. Yeah. So in Wyoming, as you said, it's supermajority in both chambers. It is 6 Democrats out of 62 legislators in the state house, so 56 Republicans. And in the state Senate, we have 2 Democrats out of 31 state senators. And they have switched between who gets to be the minority leader in that chamber as well. When it comes to working with a supermajority chamber, I think it really is a discussion of what are those common ground values that we all have in Wyoming, and what are those issues where we can figure out what legislation could look like when it comes to getting a majority in both chambers. And so I've been able to do that, not on every bill, obviously, but definitely on a couple.
Can you talk about, what does a win look like sort of when you're starting at the beginning and strategizing for how you're going to get to a majority of votes when you're bringing 6 to the table? What does that look like? And walk us through one of these wins that you've had.
Sure. So it really is trying to get stakeholders together. And so when it comes to legislation, so for example, one that I worked on this year was shepherding a bill through our Labor and Health Committee about midwives and the ability to get Medicaid reimbursement for birthing centers for midwives. And so, I think that leans on just kind of family and community, and making sure that, if you are trying to start a family, you have more access to different options for healthcare when it comes to reproductive services. Um, and so birthing centers were actually, for example, they're required to be reimbursed by Medicaid, but we don't have we didn't have in state statute the authorizing authority to actually do that. And so working with birthing centers, the first birthing center that had opened in Cheyenne, and one that was opening in Evanston, to make sure that not only do we align with federal statute when it comes to what needs to be reimbursed with Medicaid, um, but also acknowledging that this is good for everyone in the state, regardless of party, I think was super important. Another one that I got passed last year was some electric vehicle charging taxing reform. And so we had some antiquated state statute regarding alternative fuels in our state statute and how they get taxed. And it kind of came to a head in the previous year, where you would have a situation where, for those that understand EVs, you can have slower chargers and faster chargers. And the slower chargers were being taxed in a way where it was actually going to get infrastructure pulled out of the ground. And I don't think anyone really wanted people to remove chargers, regardless of how you feel about electric vehicles. Removing infrastructure doesn't help anybody. And so I think trying to figure out the ways to get broad consensus on an issue is definitely important to figure out how you get wins as the minority party.
Yeah, I was impressed that you're able to get that through, given the crazy politics around EVs and green technology to begin with. And so so when you engaged on that topic, how do you find the partners in the Republican Party that can work with you? And then how do you make sure that you're negotiating to get to a conclusion, but not negotiating away substantive
Sure.
values for your community?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always some sort of compromise somewhere when you're working to get broad consensus. I think it's impossible unless you try to go solely partisan lines to get things where you know that you can get every single aspect of a bill through untouched. And so with the EV taxation bill, for example, part of that was that I actually worked with the Transportation Committee to craft some of this legislation in previous years. And so I had folks that were the chairs of the Transportation Committee in the last couple of years, and I worked with them to make sure that it met kind of what they needed out of making sure that we properly and evenly tax electric vehicles the way we tax fuel vehicles, and of course gasoline vehicles. And of course there isn't like a one-to-one for sure, but we want to make sure at least that we get about the same amount of revenue on a per mile driven. And so trying to work out those calculations, and then working with the stakeholders that have to do the work on the ground. So whether they are groups that support electric vehicles or they're groups that support gasoline vehicles, just making sure that all of those groups get together and that we hash things out before we get to session or before the first draft even hits the floor. And so all of that work, I think, is really important. That prep work is important before you even drop a bill.
You mentioned birthing centers, and that leads into that's an important part of healthcare. The rural communities across the country, and I assume in Wyoming, have been hit hard with cuts from federal reimbursement for healthcare. Can you talk about the state of healthcare in Wyoming and what can be done to ensure that there's basic healthcare being provided across communities?
Yeah, so Wyoming is one of the few states that didn't expand Medicaid. And so when the cuts came from the federal side, a lot of those hit the expansion population. And because we don't have the expansion population covered, we didn't get the same kind of hits that other states got. We still have our matching percentage is still relatively high. I think it's 50-50. And that's because of the kind of uneven income inequality between, Teton County is one of the richest counties in the entire country. And then we have some of the poorest counties in the entire country. But because of how the FMAP is calculated for Medicaid reimbursement, we actually get a lower matching percentage. So it still costs. It's still one of the highest items in our budget. I mean, I'm sure certainly like many other state budgets, um, but uh, but we didn't get that many losses in the last couple of years because of the same cuts on the expansion population. I think during that whole process, we had the Rural Health Transformation Fund get passed as part of those cuts, and that fund, I think over 5 years, we're going to get $800 million for a population of 565,000 people in Wyoming, and so trying to figure out how we can best use that money to support rural healthcare, I think, is super important. But it's been kind of a process because um, it is a lot of money, and a lot of money that we want to make sure that stays in the state, right? Instead of getting spent on one-time services that might end up spending most of that money out of state. Um, and so one of the things that we had tried to push, because we are a Republican majority state, was working with the center with CMS, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, on trying to see if we could implement a perpetuity fund to make sure that we could best use those dollars over a longer period of time. Unfortunately, CMS denied that. I think we actually had a pretty good case on making that happen. But I think we will have challenges in the next 5 years of how we make sure that that money actually makes for better healthcare outcomes in the state of Wyoming.
You mentioned the disparity in your state and within your district. I mean, Jackson Hole is world famous for a place where the powerful global elite will meet and
For sure.
Do everything. And then you also have, it's also a tourism economy where you have many minimum wage jobs where people are trying to take care of those folks. What's the state on the ground, and then how do you try to help those who are struggling in an increasing cost area, especially in the area of like housing, childcare, other ways?
For sure. Yes. So Teton County, I mean, I think not only are we one of the wealthiest counties in the country, we are one of the counties that has the most income inequality in the entire country. Right. So I think you nailed it on the head. We get the global elite. Not only do they meet here, right, for something like a global economic forum, which I have never gotten an invitation to, unfortunately. I wonder why. And the service workers who have to serve coffee or take them on tours for the park or guide them on rafting trips. That the service workers are probably the toughest to make sure that they stay a part of our community, right? And so if land is so unaffordable where they can't afford to ever build a house here, then they spend a couple of years here, they burn out, and then they move somewhere else. And so trying to solve that has been one of the things that I've been trying to work on in every single year that I've been in office. Part of it, I think, is involved in tax policy. I think tax policy drives the incentives of who decides to live somewhere and how much of that can get reinvested in the community. And so property taxes have been a big issue, but also we don't have a what's the word that I'm thinking of? We don't have a real estate transfer tax. So if you buy real estate, there's no sales tax that you get charged on. And it's funny because realtors tell me even that they get offers from people from other states to buy property in Wyoming, and they're like, "Why isn't there a real estate transfer tax on my on the costs that I'm incurring from buying property?" Because they're used to it, but we don't have any of that. So I have proposed in past years using a real estate transfer tax to help build more affordable housing. And we've even tried to shift it and change it a bit to make it more appealable. But I think we have too many people that are a no new taxes crowd in any way, shape, or form. And so that becomes really difficult to pass anything uh, that that could disincentivize the ultra wealthy to help build more housing for those that live and work here permanently.
Yeah, I can't imagine that the disparity must be shocking. And then your tools are so limited, so it makes it really hard. I guess we've gone from economic disparity, childcare, charging stations, and all these topics. How did you find yourself in this position to try to be managing this array of issues?
Sure. So I will say it is one thing that I love about being a legislator is that you cover so much ground. So if you like learning, I think it's definitely a really interesting job. Not only that you're representing your constituents, I think that is probably the most fulfilling part, but being able to learn about almost everything or anything has been one of the great parts of the job. I am a software developer by trade, by education. And so I actually still have a full-time job being a software developer. In Wyoming, we meet 60 working days over 2 years. That comes out to a 1-month session 1 year and a 2-month session the following year. And so to pay my mortgage in Jackson Hole, I still have to hold a full-time job. And so it's tricky kind of being able to balance that. The way I ended up being a legislator was I came to Wyoming in 2015, and part of it was, okay, if I want to stay and be a Wyomingite permanently, how do I contribute back to my community? And so some of that was volunteer work. I certainly did volunteer work for a while. But I think when the 2016 election rolled around, I got more involved in my state party, but I also got more involved in my local city election. So I helped someone run for city council because, being in a supermajority state, I think concentrating on federal work wasn't something where I felt like I would be most effective. And so how do I get more involved locally? And so 2018 rolled around, my state representative ended up running for the state senate. And so I threw my hat in the ring for state representative when I was 36. No, 32 at the time. Time flies.
It does. It does. What's your advice for folks who are living in, pretty dark red states and it feels like there's no hope or there's no path? How do you A, stay motivated, and then 2, be strategic and impactful?
I think one of the first things I learned in the legislature is that individual elected officials aren't as partisan as we are portrayed to be, whether it's in the national sphere or in the local sphere. I think, I think my perception of the federal government is a little bit colored by over partisanship, but I think on the state level, there's still plenty of room to work across the aisle and get things done. I think that for those that live in ruby red states, I think it really is just developing relationships and figuring out what are those shared values that we can work on. So for me, it's talking about community, it's talking about economic opportunity, it's talking about affordability. And I think that those are lines and values that cut across the entire state. And so that's what I talk about, whether it's to individual citizens or my fellow colleagues on how we can work on problems together.
And in this part-time legislature where you're having to show up for blocks of time, but obviously governing goes on year round, how do you balance your time? How do you think about how you, with a full-time job and responsibilities, do your public service, but also maintain a private life?
It is a hard balance. I think having a full-time job as well as this part-time job, which takes a full-time amount of time, is a tough one to balance. I think I'm lucky in that I have a profession that gives me the flexibility. And so part of that is actually, just broaching to your, if it's something where you have to do both, where you still need a full-time job to pay the bills, it's broaching with your employer, whether it's something your employer would even be open to. And some employers maybe, because if it's one where it makes a big impact in the state, who their elected officials are, I think for them having that relationship is amazing. But it all depends on the type of work you're doing, the type of employment you can have, and that's something that I try to push towards, making it easier for people to run, right? So that's some of that is systemic, built into the state system that you may operate under. So in Wyoming, we don't even have healthcare for state legislators, and our salary is, I think my taxable take home was less than $20,000 for the state legislative job, and so trying to figure out, at least, one of the biggest hurdles is making sure that you have healthcare. I think if we could move towards having healthcare for legislators, I think it would make the work-life balance a lot easier for a lot of people, or work balance a lot easier for a lot of other potential state elected officials. But otherwise, I think some of it is just being organized, but sometimes things do drop through the cracks, where you try to figure out how much time you can actually focus on being a legislator versus making sure you can live the rest of your life.
And are there prospects for picking up seats? And how are you doing that work? And I guess sort of how is this administration being perceived in Wyoming right now?
Sure. So we are the only state, I believe, where the Freedom Caucus actively control one of the chambers in the state legislature. And so for me, I'm working on Democratic seats that are currently held by Freedom Caucus seats, or that are open seats. And because I think these last 2 years, the Freedom Caucus have had the chance to see what actually being in charge is like. Like, they're the dog that actually caught the car, and I think people actually aren't very happy with how that's turned out, regardless of partisanship. So on both sides, and so I think that there is room for pickup for Democrats in Wyoming, and I've been working with candidates to make that happen.
Amazing. I got to ask, you're the first Chinese American to serve in the Wyoming legislature. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and what bringing your background into the Capitol means?
Sure. I think for me, it mostly leans into, I'm not a rancher. I'm not a fourth generation Wyomingite. And so I bring into it kind of a child of immigrants experience. But it was immigrants who came to the U.S. to chase the American dream, right? I think to see if it's possible, from the places that they came, whether they could make it work in the U.S. And I saw what they did to volunteer in the state that they ended up in, which was Georgia. So that's where I was born and raised. And they did a lot of volunteer work and work into their community. And I think that's what really drove me to decide, okay, if I'm making this my community, how do I better it, give back to it more than it gave to me? And so I think I try to bring that perspective of, it is about lifting all of us up together, whether we are a stranger in a strange land, or we've been here for 10 generations, or in Wyoming, it's very different than Georgia, because we have a Native American reservation in Wyoming. And how do we make sure that all of these communities can be uplifted? Yeah, so I think it's always been interesting trying to integrate that, given not necessarily a lot of other legislators in Wyoming have that same experience.
Yeah. How'd you find your way to Wyoming? I'm just curious.
So born and raised in Georgia, I went to Carnegie Mellon for a computer science degree and spent most of my career in New York City being a software developer before moving out and feeling like I needed something other than a big city for a little while, and then maybe I would jump back to a city. And then I fell in love with Wyoming and felt like, okay, one year here is not enough. I didn't want to live the rest of my life here.
Wow. And you've been at the legislative sessions for 10 years now. How do you think about continuing to try to balance private life, public life, impact, and what's next?
Sure. It's interesting because people always ask me, do I want to do something bigger? And, they always point to like the federal government or maybe the state executive branch. But for me, I don't want to permanently live in Cheyenne. I also don't want to live in DC. I love my community. And so I love staying there. And I also don't see the federal government as being above the state government, right? I actually see them as partners that should be working to make all of us better together. And so I'm very happy in the state legislature, but I also don't think I want to be in the state legislature forever. At some point, I do want to pass it on to someone else who can accurately represent the community. And so I don't know when that will be, but I also know that, we have a state senator who's been in for almost 50 years. I'm not interested in being here 50 years, for sure.
Well, we hope you stick with it a little longer. We love having you in the New Deal, and we look forward to hearing about more of these initiatives coming out of Wyoming. And God, I would love to have some sort of New Deal conference there where we can
I would love that.
I can talk at the same time. Thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure as well.
An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. And because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars were used in the making of this podcast.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.